Okay.
We also have Deon here, right?
Yes, Deon is here, doctor is here. Perfect.
Maybe if you can.
I use my platform as a way to educate others, the youth mostly,
Amanda, can we
because
stop
this is
the
what we're
video
focused
first?
on issues that curb.
This conference has a specific theme, which is climate finance. So it basically deals with the issues that youth encounter in accessing finance to do adaptation and mitigation measures.
The young people, we are not well coordinated yet. We work in isolation. And in order for funds to reach us, we need to come together. This is why this conference is happening. Once we come together, coordinate ourselves, we can create synergies and networks of all these various initiatives and coalitions of youth organizations. And then after that, we can look at financing mechanisms which do exist, but they are not directly targeted at youth. They are directed at a broader scope. So I think in order to bridge this gap, we would need to start with young people being brought together, coordinated, so we understand what are they working on and how much of the adaptation or mitigation funds can we give to the young people.
First of all, African youth is one of the most important groups for the near and the long future, because they will form the workforce actually for Africa. And it is known that, for example, for agriculture sector, the majority now, the average age from the farmer is quite high. So we need to try also to ensure that we can attract youth into agribusiness, agriculture, food security issues. And climate change and climate smart agriculture provide a really good opportunity for that, because now with the Paris Agreement and a lot of countries put in climate smart agriculture as one of the approaches towards adaptation and mitigation, it's important that the youth fully engaged at all levels, like at national level with the governments, with the policy makers, but also at the global and regional context.
Last year we had
for action, time to speak, time to talk, time to put good policies on the paper shouldn't come to an end, but there should be more of implementation. We are done with just talking. It's time now to put our words into action and to ensure that there is more impact, not only in our communities, but also on the African continent and the world at large.
I use my platform as a way to educate others, the youth mostly, because this is what we're focused on issues that curb climate change.
So this conference has a specific theme, which is climate finance. So it basically deals with the issues that youth encounter in accessing finance to do adaptation and mitigation measures.
The young people, we are not well coordinated yet. We work in isolation. And in order for funds to reach us, we need to come together. This is why this conference is happening. Once we come together, coordinate ourselves, we can create synergies and networks of all these various initiatives and coalitions of youth organizations. And then after that, we can look at financing mechanisms which do exist, but they are not directly targeted at youth. They are directed at a broader scope. So I think in order to bridge this gap, we would need to start with young people being brought together, coordinated, so we understand what are they working on and how much of the adaptation or mitigation funds can we give to the young people.
First of all, African youth is one of the most important groups for the near and the long future, because they will form the workforce actually for Africa. And it is known that, for example, for agriculture sector, the majority now, the average age from the farmer is quite high. So we need to try also to ensure that we can attract youth into agribusiness, agriculture, food security issues. And climate change and climate smart agriculture provide a really good opportunity for that, because now with the Paris Agreement and a lot of countries put in climate smart agriculture as one of the approaches towards adaptation and mitigation, it's important that the youth fully engaged at all levels, like at national level with the governments, with the policy makers, but also at the global and regional context.
Last year we had
for action, time to speak, time to talk, time to put good policies on the paper shouldn't come to an end, but there should be more of implementation. We are done with just talking. it's time now to put our words into action and to ensure that there is more impact, not only in our communities, but also on the African continent and the world at large.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. This is the African Youth Conference on Climate Change, convened by AIC, which is the African Youth Initiative on Climate Change and the High Level Champion. My name is Fatou Jeng, and I'll be your host or your facilitator for day one of AfriYOCCC. AfriYOCCC is the biggest continental event bringing young people all over Africa to discuss climate-related issues, because as we know, Africa is one of the countries or one of the continents that is vulnerable to the climate change crisis, even though we are one of the continents that actually emit the least to the growing climate crisis. So as young people, we have a very fundamental role to play as far as addressing the climate crisis, as climate defenders, as policymakers, using our NGOs, etc., to ensure that we continue to amplify the message, we continue to ensure that there is climate action across all levels. In this 3-day event, we're going to discuss pertinent climate-related issues from young climate activists, from young climate experts who've been in the field for the past few years, policymakers, etc., because it is time that young people continue to take the lead in ensuring that the climate crisis that we face in the continent is being addressed. So do join us for the next 3 days, because we're going to have a lineup of very interesting and engaging conversations as Africa takes up the lead to host COP27 next year. So just so we start the event, I will call on the Executive Director of AIC to give the welcoming address, Kausu. So we wait on Kausu to give us the official welcoming address as we kick off AfriYOCCC 2021.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry, I have a challenge with my internet. Good afternoon, everyone. Fatou, if you can confirm you could hear me.
We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure. And I'm very excited that you all are gathered here for the 4th African Youth Conference on Climate Change. And I warmly welcome all of you for taking time to join this event. As you would have already read, AfriYOCCC is a platform that provides opportunity for young people to share ideas, to learn from one another, and also to exchange best practices. This is the 4th time we are hosting AfriYOCCC. The first one we held was in Zimbabwe, in Victoria Falls. The second one we held was in Nairobi in Kenya, and then the third one was in Abuja in Nigeria. And it's very interesting to note that all these events were held as physical events, but unfortunately, because of the circumstance we find ourselves in today, this event, which is the 4th African Youth Conference, is going to be held as a virtual event. And we are excited that this 4th African Youth Conference on Climate Change provides opportunity for large participation because it's a virtual event. So we are very much excited that we are seeing large numbers who have indeed registered for this event. And as we speak now, we have quite a number of people who have enjoyed. This itself is a demonstration of the fact that young people from Africa are really interested. We are beginning to understand the impact of climate change on our livelihoods and also on our future. And we are indeed not sitting aloof, but also taking part in the solution to address climate change. We are so much inspired by the level of participation, and also not just participation, but also by the lineup of speakers that we have for this event. As you have seen in the program, the first day of the event is going to be more of technical session, where we would take the opportunity to build your capacity on some of the critical issues around climate change and also leading towards to COP26. The second day is going to be very exciting as well, where we are going to have a high-level panel discussion with the high-level champions in participation. We also hope to have the chair of the African Group of Negotiators on this panel, and as well as the Assistant Secretary General on climate change, or the Special Envoy on climate change, Selwyn Hart, who is going to also be in the panel. Of course, we have our youth participant on the panel as well, who is the chairperson of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. So it's going to be very exciting. And the third day of the event will climax all the 3 days of AfriYOCCC. So the third day, we are going to see the launch of the African Youth Position Paper for COP26. And I hope you are all expecting this day. Apart from the position paper, we also hope to launch a process for the establishment of the Green Book, which would compile best practices from African youth, which will be sent to COP 2026. So it's going to be a 3 days packed with interesting and exciting events, and we want you to participate, not just for today, but all the 3 days. The second day, as I mentioned, you will have the opportunity to also share your ideas or make input into the position paper that we are developing. At this moment, let me thank all of you once again and welcome all of you for participating. And particularly, let me let me take the opportunity to also thank the high-level champions who are really co-hosting this event. And again, to our partners, the Open Society Initiative for East Africa, as well as the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, the Restless Development, the Restless Development, and also, and also, I mean, all of you, I would really want to thank you for making time to join this event. There are quite other side events that will be hosted alongside, and I'm sure our moderator will share details of those side events as we move on. Once again, I welcome you to this event, and it's really, I really wish you a successful participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kausu, Executive Director of AfriYOCCC. One thing that you've actually said that has really sort of like captured my attention in particular is the fact that you mentioned something that was very important, which is young people in Africa are learning about the climate crisis. They are not leaning back, but they're joining the fight against the climate crisis, and they're taking active role to find solutions in addressing and adapting to the climate crisis. We can now see young people in Africa being in the front line, doing conservative work, creating awareness about the climate crisis, engaging policymakers, among other actions that they are doing within the continent to ensure that they don't sit back, but to ensure that there is rapid awareness and action as far as the climate crisis is concerned. And that is why this event, as we mentioned initially, is very important, because young people are here again, showing that there is a growing interest from young people within the continent to talk about the climate crisis and how we can address it. And this will definitely take me to the next session or next activity of today, which is a presentation from Dr. Richard Munang, who will talk about bridging gaps for climate action in Africa, looking specifically at making youth leadership in solutions a reality. So thank you, Kasim, and I'll welcome Dr. Richard Munang to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Fatu, and thanks to all those who are joining in from all corners of the world, and to the executive director and everyone present, all protocols observed. It is a great honor for me to be with you here today. And without much ado, let me start off with this African proverb, which tells us that you cannot build a house for last year's summer. This African proverb expresses the moment we are in today. And the message is clear. Climate action cannot be postponed any longer. About 30 days ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published the 2021 Physical Science Basis Report, aptly called A Code Red for Humanity. The core finding of this analysis showed that the world is likely to breach the set 1.5 degrees warming threshold in just 2 decades. For every 1 degree of warming, extreme daily precipitation events will intensify by 7%. We are already on this slippery slope. But what does this mean for Africa, a region that is already heating up twice as fast as the rest of the globe? This means that the safe threshold of 1.5 degrees will likely be breached much earlier than any other region and will escalate risk severity in the African continent, whether it is the worst drought in 40 years that we are seeing hitting Madagascar, or the worsening water crisis in South Africa with some dams operating at 1% capacity, or a 2.3 reduction in rainfall in Zambia, or shorter rainy season in East Africa, or extreme heat waves in North Africa, or the decreased precipitation in Central Africa, or the flooding in West Africa, as we see in Nigeria, where cities like Lagos that are already less than 2 meters above sea level are exposed to torrential rains and sea level rise. The die is cast. This risk funnel out to manifest in the region's economy, where a GDP drop of up to 15% that was originally predicted to happen by 2030 as a result of climate change will move much closer to the present. And with this, the escalation of socioeconomic misery that is already at breaking point is guaranteed. Be it the 257 million citizens who go to bed hungry in the African continent, or the 12 million young people who need jobs every year amidst shrinking economies that remain disenfranchised in unemployment, or the up to 60 million children that are malnourished and costing the continent up to 16% of the GDP, amongst many others. Despite all these, another variable, the COVID-19 global pandemic, has been added to this equation of stressors. These realities will be weighing heavily on the moral conscience of the entire global community as they convene at COP26 in just about 54 days from today, with a full agenda including securing global net zero emissions by 2050 and keeping temperatures below 1.5 degrees, mobilizing finance, adapting to protect communities, natural habitats, and working together to deliver on these aspects will be key. The real test for all of us today is how we can then be able to take this climate action agenda and deliver it within the lens of accelerating socio-economic transformation for the African continent. As we drive the green pandemic recovery as proposed in the United Nations Environment Programme Emissions Gap Report 2020, but how the youth can take leadership in the implementation ambition is our own fierce urgency of now. The African youth are the biggest non-state actors constituency. The youth, they are the powerhouse of Africa. And without them, Africa will never be able to drive a socio-economically viable just transition. Therefore, to drive ambitious implementation, you the youth, and those young at heart, as you listen in today, you will need to espouse some foundational attributes. Like a lion, you will need to understand your own territory and act within it. By territory here, what I mean is the socio-economic context. In Africa, as we speak today, this means that ensuring implementation of climate action leverages on the economic locomotive of the continent, the informal sector that employs over 80% of people in the continent, and they face the biggest vulnerability challenge of climate change. Beyond understanding territory, ambitious implementation will need vision of an eagle, which can spot and focus on a target as far as 3 kilometers away. Such understanding of vision, what I call an eye for solutions, will be critical to ensure climate action becomes an accelerator of socio-economic development. As an example, Africa's primary source of emissions is land-based, accounting for about 56% of continental emissions. A visionary approach to cutting these emissions will be establishing climate action enterprises for waste recovery to domestic fuel briquettes and biofertilizer amongst other non-capital intensive areas to tap market opportunities. In addition, you will need an attribute, what I call the discipline of an ox. The endurance, the persistence, and consistency displayed by an ox on a plow is the hallmark of discipline that underpins success in any venture. You will need this discipline to drive the implementation of climate action from a socio-economic lens. To crown it all, these attributes, you will need wisdom, which must guide all your actions. And these 4 attributes I've given you today needs to be exercised within the following principles. And the first is, as a continent, climate action must be leveraged as an investment opportunity. A climate change narrative must urgently graduate from projecting liability to projecting socio-economic and investment opportunities. Youth, who constitute up to 60% of the unemployed in Africa, will usher themselves to climate action if they see the economic opportunities it presents. The enabling policy pillars are largely already in place. As we're speaking today, over 98% of African countries have ratified the Paris Climate Change Agreement. In the NDCs that are ratified, 70% of these NDCs prioritize clean energy and agriculture as well as forestry. These are already opportunities. And in addition to this, we have climate smart agriculture, clean energy, feed-in tariffs, forestry policy, to name just a few. Every young person should leverage this freely available information and start implementing it from a socio-economic lens, leveraging their communities as a market. For example, through our work in the continent with young people, we see simple climate action solutions of solar dryers, solar fridges, decentralized to agro-value chain actors in communities, helping reverse post-harvest losses that are costing the continent up to 48 billion. That takes me to the second point, youth skills retooling. You cannot address any challenge while ignoring your own powerhouse. African youth are Africa's powerhouse, and how they can become drivers of enterprise opportunities through the climate lens is critical in increasing implementation ambition, improving, refining, and adapting young people's skills to align with tapping socioeconomic opportunities is critical. Through an incubation approach, we develop called innovative volunteerism. We are structurally guiding young people. We're inspiring young people of different backgrounds to turn their passions into profits and retool their skills in developing and decentralizing simple climate action solutions that address on-demand areas among communities. Many of you here today are innovative volunteers. Through these, many of you are fabricating solar dryers. You are turning agricultural waste into fuel briquettes that are 2 times cheaper than charcoal to minimize the impact of indoor pollution that kills over 500,000 Africans each and every year. These young people who are availing themselves to seize opportunities are sharing their experiences. They are sharing their lessons online to influence more young people to take up innovative volunteerism as a tool to drive climate change. That takes me to the third point. We must leverage on policy incentives, especially physical incentives. Favorable policies, especially physical policies, play a significant role in shifting market behavior and especially investment from one area to another. A simple example to illustrate what I am saying here today, using Kenya as an example, where physical policy incentive exempting value-added tax on LPG led to a significant behavioral change in both consumers and producers in the market. In less than a decade, the number of liquid petroleum gas filling plants rose from 9 to 105 plants, while consumption almost doubled from 150 to 300 tons over 3 years. Accordingly, targeted physical incentives are critical, but youth must seize on them to bring impact to scale. For example, to minimize risk of charcoal and biomass, and unlock opportunities, the latest step that Kenya, for example, has taken to incentivize clean cooking is through the Finance Act of 2021. This legislation exempts 3 classes of clean cooking from 16% VAT, including sustainable briquettes. What does this mean? It means those in Kenya can tap into this. Uganda have done a similar thing to take the VAT off liquid petroleum. The youth of Africa should leverage such incentives and devise their own climate action enterprises that tap into these incentives. Yes, that is not enough, but we must start with what we have, because it is only through that we can then be able to generate empirical data on the work that you do to further incentivize further policy incentives to be recalibrated, such as affordable financing for the young people who are engaged in developing climate action solutions needed by the informal sector, or tax holidays to young entrepreneurs who establish climate action solutions to enable them to minimize their tax burden during their formative years. And that takes me to the fourth point, which is non-policy incentives. Policy incentives, regardless of how timely they may be, will never accomplish that much if they fall on passionless citizens. The responsibility of devising competitive solutions that turn challenges into opportunities to actualize the intended impact of policies falls squarely on each and every one of us, and especially the biggest constituency in the continent, the youth. This, however, calls for a right mindset, a mindset of discipline, a mindset of purposeful passion. This is irreplaceable in motivating an individual to action, and we owe ourselves, each and every one of us, regardless of where we are, the task of taking implementation of the personal responsibility. That takes me to the last point. We must become values-based leaders. In the mid-40s to the late 50s, on to the early 60s, as the clamor for self-determined rule reached fever pitch in Africa, there arose self-appointed men and women who espouse boldness, who espouse unshakable unity. They espouse dedication and selflessness and fidelity to a struggle to liberate their people, a task which was their own unborrowed vision, a calling they had to execute. Their every move was governed by a laser-sharp focus and clarity of vision to win independence for their people. No amount of persecution, lack, threats could stand in their way. They did it not for themselves, but for the future generations they had no hope of ever meeting. They were joined ideologically in the struggle by timeless values of selflessness and character of discipline and humility. They did not postpone this call for a day in the hope for elusive perfection. This is the foundation of values-based leadership that we all must identify with and champion wherever we are to drive climate action in the continent. It is leadership premise of selflessness and taking personal responsibility to touch many lives with what we have. Today, Africa urgently needs climate action to drive socio-economic resilience. And among the most important constituency to tap is you, the youth. Because we know that in the cycles of life, it happens that a unique challenge befalls one generation, which must be solved to guarantee the next safe existence of future generations. Climate change is the challenge of our generation. And we have only 2 decades within which to change course and guarantee both present and future generations. Stand up and become a values-based leader to be counted. Thank you.
Dr. Richard, I am definitely inspired. You've talked on a lot of issues, and wrapping up your presentation talking about how climate change is the challenge of our decade and our future at stake, and it is our responsibility, everyone's responsibility, to join the fight in addressing the climate crisis. You talked about also a lot of other things which were definitely inspiring and educative, especially some of the qualities we need as young people, taking part or taking the lead in addressing the climate crisis. You also mentioned that, you know, climate change is climate action is definitely something that we cannot postpone any longer, because yes, we have seen the devastating impacts of climate change in the continent, from rising sea level rise, from inundation, from drought, from farming, from displacement, etc. There is a lot of climate challenges that the continent faces, and definitely young people, as you mentioned, we are the biggest non-state actors, and we are the powerhouse of the continent. So this shows the important role that young people continue to play in addressing the climate crisis. And I have a lot of takeaways from this, from the issue of us leveraging climate action as an economic investment, having young people engage in sort of like community sort of like mobilization, having young climate entrepreneurs, etc. So Dr. Richard Munang, I'm sure I've seen when you were doing your presentation, I saw the participants raising their hands. I'm sure they have like a lot of things to ask you, but because of time, we're so sorry that we cannot be able to take like questions, but I have been inspired, and I'm sure the rest of the participants here have been inspired. Thank you very much for this. And everyone here, you can always follow Dr. Richard on social media to just take up or continue the conversation from there, because this is conversation. These are conversations that we always need to continue to have. Discussions that we need to always continue to have as far as issues concerning climate change is concerned. Thank you once again, Dr. Richard. This was really a very insightful deliberation from you. So Dr. Richard actually sort of like touched on the IPCC report and how Africa and Africa's future is actually at stake, especially when it comes to the environmental consequences that we're having. That is why we're going straight into a discussion that will be on the key findings of the IPCC report 6th assessment, and that will be done by our very own Dr. Youba Sokona. So Dr. you are very much welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Can I be co-host in order to share my screen? Am I a okay, yes, I'm a co-host. Just a second. I'm having some trouble in sharing the
Doctor?
Yes.
Is it still like that? You still can't share it? Or you can't, you can share, one of our team members will basically get in touch and then we'll help you share it on our screen while you start the discussion, if that's okay.
Yes, because I'm having some trouble. I do not know why.
It happens all the time, technical glitches, so yeah. So thank you very much again, Dr. Richard, Muna, and as I mentioned earlier, I know we have some people that have questions for Dr. Richard. So he's on social media, on Twitter, Facebook. You can always connect with him. And as I mentioned already, we're having Dr. Youba, who is going to be doing a presentation on the IPCC 6th assessment report. And if most of you were following the conversations on social media, especially last month, there has been a lot of discussion about the findings of the IPCC, especially with how Africa is really very, very much vulnerable, especially with the climate crisis and all the other environmental challenges that we are facing. So Dr. Richard,
As I'm having a problem, I think that I will ask them to share, to go with the slides I sent.
Yes, we're going to have the slide up for you, Doctor. Yes. There you go.
Okay.
We're back.
As I indicated, sorry for that happened. Okay, sorry for that happened frequently. I said that morning from Bamako. As I indicated, thank you for inviting me to be part of that conversation. I just go quickly through the list of the impressive participants. I just realized that there is very few participants from the French-speaking countries. And I think that you need to provide some effort and then to increase their participation. Maybe it's related to language. Anyway, let me try to highlight some of the key findings of the latest IPCC report and then what that means for Africa. The next slide, please. Next, please. IPCC, back. IPCC produced 4 reports so far in the this cycle. This is assessment cycle starting with starting in 2015. And then the first one was the global warming of 1.5. The second in the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. And then the third is climate change and land, desertification, drought, land degradation, and us, and climate change. And then the last one is climate change, the physical science basis. And then we will be producing 2 other reports next year on impact, vulnerability, adaptation, and mitigation that will complete and then the report of the 6th cycle. What can we take from those 4 reports that has been produced so far? It indicates clearly that recent changes in the climate are widespread, rapid, and intensifying, and unprecedented in thousands of years. They indicate also that it's indisputable that human activities are causing climate change, making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rains, and drought, and more frequent and severe. Unless there are immediate, rapid, and large-scale reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 will be beyond reach. And then the climate we experience in the future depend on our decision now. Next, please. Those are some of the key elements that can be captured. And then the report, the latest one on the physical science, indicated that the CO2 concentration are currently the highest in at least the 2 million years. The sea level rise fastest rates in at least 3,000 years. And then for at least 1,000 years, Arctic sea ice area is the lowest. And the glacial retreat in at least 2,000 years has been unprecedented. And then those are some key elements we need to have in mind in the human history, in the history of the world, the planet, from the 2 million years to 1,000 years. And then those are the changes that we have seen that happening in a very fastest way. Next, please. And that implication are the extreme heat. They are more frequent, more intense, heavy rainfall, more frequent, more intense, and drought increasing in some regions. And then more with intensity, and then the fire weather also are more frequent. And the ocean are warming, acidifying, and losing oxygen. Those are the consequences of what we already indicated. Next, please. And with every additional amount of global warming, changes get larger. And then you can see those 3 different figures, simulated figures, from 1.5 degree to 2 degree, and then to 4 degree. You can see how things get much more worsened. And then the warmer is getting much more increased. From the 1.5, the 2, and the 4, we can see the differences. That means half a degree or 1 degree is very important. Next, please. We can see also that with any additional amount of global warming, changes get larger, and then the extreme rainfall intensifies by 7% for more additional 1 degree. You can see the difference between 1.5 degree and to 2 degrees. Next, please. And what do we know about Africa in that context? As has been highlighted in the previous speaker, part of Africa have warmed by more than 1.5 degrees. Some of the problems we are seeing in the region is if at the global level, we have an average of 1.5 degrees at the global level. In part of the African continent have warmed more than 1.5 degrees. And then it has been indicated on this is clear also that 3.8% share of global carbon dioxide emission from the continent. That means the continent not really contributing that much to the global warming, and does not mean that's not very important. Increased exposure and vulnerability of the continent is very high, and that is related to a number of other challenges because the continent have limited infrastructure, have limited resources, have limited capacity and capability, and then to cope with any of those extreme events, any of those problems, and the climate is add-on development challenges the continent is facing, and then the poverty and the governance issues, and then the fragility of the different ecosystems. Climate change became an extra burden, And then we have seen also that many people think that the continent is highly rural, but we are getting vastly urbanized. And then the urban system in the African context is completely different from what we have seen so far everywhere. If you look at any capital city in African countries, the majority of the country, we see lorries full of charcoal and firewood for cooking needs. And then that has a huge consequences. That means a large part of urban people have rural practices. And then the rate also of development of the infrastructure in the urban and the urbanization rate also go far faster than the development of urban infrastructure. And at the same time, there is very limited lock-in in the African context, because we need to build our energy system. We need to build our agricultural system. We need to build the stock of new houses much more important than the existing stocks. And then we need to develop our infrastructure. And then that can be done in compatible with the climate. So climate resilient and low carbon development, those are some opportunities we need to take in the African context. Next, please. And then what are the common regional changes with the what we have seen so far? And then the mean temperature and hot extreme have emerged above natural variability, and then relative to 1850 and 1900 in all regions in Africa with high confidence. And then the rate also of the surface temperature increase have generally been more rapid in Africa than the global average, with human-induced climate change being the dominant driver, and then this also with high confidence. And then the observed increases in hot extremes, including heat waves, and decrease in cold extreme, including cold waves, are projected to continue throughout the 21st century with additional global warming. This also is with high confidence. You know, in many African countries, actually, air conditioning is no longer a luxury. It's a necessity. It's like the heating system in the temperate climates, because in winter, you need heating. In the African context, we got the increase of the temperature, and then that became something that's very important. But so far, it's seen as something that's very luxury. Next, please. Next, please. Okay, and then the marine heat waves also have become more frequent since the 20th century and are projected to increase around Africa. This also is high confidence. And then relative sea level have increased at a highest rate than global mean sea level around Africa over the last 3 decades. Relative sea level rise is likely to virtually certain to continue around Africa, contributing to increases in the frequency, severity of coastal flooding in low-lying area to coastal erosion along most standing coasts. This also is high confidence. And then the frequency and intensity also of heavy precipitation events are projected to increase almost everywhere in Africa with additional global warming. As you can see, all what is common in the region is with high confidence. And then none of them is disputable scientifically basis. Next, please. And then what are the current experience of climate change? As we can see it, this figure is taken from Somalia. The rising temperatures larger over land than the ocean. And then we see more frequent intense climate extremes, such as heat waves, as I indicated earlier, heavy rainfalls and droughts. And then, you know, we had experiences actually in many West African countries in the Sahel region, flooding, and that has been devastating, and then some lives has been lost due to those heavy rainfall when people are expecting much more drought in the area. And then we are also seeing the region, novel climates in the tropics, that is the shifting of some dryland areas, and a sea level rise of 16 centimeters during the 20th century, extreme weather level during also high tide and storm, increased rain and wind speed of cyclones, and then such as what we have seen in the Horn of Africa and then the Eastern Africa, and then we all have in mind the cyclone Ida and Kenneth. And then the general, one of the main and the biggest problem also the continent is lack of reliable data and lack of also some specific studies in order to better inform our knowledge, our understanding and the policies related to how to cope with those events. Next, please. And if we look at the observed changes across the continent, and then taking from the North Africa to Madagascar Island, in North Africa, there is an increases in aridity, meteorological, hydrological, and agricultural and ecological droughts. In West Africa, an increase in river flooding, increase in drying and agricultural ecological droughts, increase in monsoon precipitation during the 20th century. In Central Africa, decreases in standardized precipitation index, increase in agricultural ecological drought. In Eastern Africa, decreases in mean precipitation, decreases in snow and glaciers. Southern Africa, decrease in mean precipitation, increase in heavy precipitation, and pluvial flooding, increase in aridity, agricultural and ecological drought. In Madagascar Island, increases in aridity. And those are some highlights of what we have observed in the different parts of the region. Next, please. And then the future global climate change hotspots. When we look at a global map at that level, we see that the Mediterranean, the West Africa, and the Sahel, the Fimbo biome, and then in Southern Africa, we see that in fact, if we look at the global climate change hotspots that we have been identified in the IPCC special report of 1.5, these are places that will see particularly severe and widespread impact. As you can see, half of these are in Africa and they cover most of the continent. And Africa as a whole is a climate change hotspot. Next, please. And then as I indicated, there is a climate zone are shifting in Africa. And then arid, dry area are growing and shifting as already recorded in the Mediterranean, the Sahel, and Southern Africa. And then novel and unprecedented hot climates in the tropical regions, and cooler zones are shrinking and shifting to higher latitude and higher altitude. As you can see, observe regional climate change zones shift from the other indicated Mediterranean, the Sahel, the Zambia, and Zimbabwe, and that we need to bring that in the different policies we are implementing or we are thinking in the various sectors that are sensitive to those different issues. Next, please. And desertification is a critical issue in the African continent. And drought, they are frequent, prolonged, and intense, and caused and or exacerbated by the climate change. And drought are also hotter, and that's more severe. And then the human activities exacerbated by drought, as I indicated, the wood harvesting and then using wood and charcoal and the agricultural practices, because the agricultural system is extensive system rather than intensification. In order to increase the production, we clear more land, we cut more trees, we transform more woody area to agricultural areas. And then we also seen the overgrazing, trampling, soil compacting, and erosion from the wind and water. loss that involve loss of soil fertility, lower water retention. And then here again, we do have a huge problem of a data gap and extent of degraded land vegetation mass. And as you can see also, we can identify in the Horn of Africa, in the whole Sahel band, a prolonged drought and overgrazing, and in the other Africa that get even much more drier. Next, please. And then there's some social vulnerability and then related to ecological vulnerability, fragility also. The social also, not only vulnerability, but fragility at the same time related to poverty, malnutrition, disease. And then as we know in the sub-Saharan Africa, 41% live in extreme poverty. And it's a multidimensional poverty combination of deprivations, vulnerability area of dryland, coastlands, cities, informal settlements. 85 to 95% of the people who are vulnerable and exposed to climate risk live in Africa and Asia, particularly Southeast Asia. And food insecurity, food prices, income losses, livelihood, health displacement are among increasing the vulnerability. And then the vulnerable group are subsistence farmers, indigenous people, local fishing communities, women, children, and elderly. And then the issue of women is very important as a significant labor force limited by gender inequalities. And then those are some of the elements we need to consider. Next, please. And then if we look at what are the projected regional changes, and then from the looking at 1.5 degree, this is the upper graphs. And then the 2 degree, this is the middle one, and the 4 degree, you can see differences between the two with the increase of the temperature and then the increase of the precipitation. And then that indicates that with additional increase in global warming, changes in hot and cold temperature extreme, means and maximum, one day precipitation get larger. And then the projector also will see the differences between the 1.5, 2 degrees watt, and 4 watt. Next, please. And then if we now look at the food and agricultural impact across the continent, as you can see it throughout the continent, and then looking at from the northern part of the continent to the western part, central part, eastern, and southern, and then you see some oases in the northern Africa has been abandoned. A farmer in Ethiopia lose about $22 US per hectare, and then through soil erosion, with Malagasy farmer vulnerable to shock from extreme, and then poverty rate in Ghana increased by 5.4% in 2015 from loss of productivity. And then in sum, the biggest climate impact can be seen in the food, agriculture, and health sector, with knock-on effect on poverty, the economy, migration, and conflict. And food security will be increasingly affected by future climate change through yield decline, especially in the tropic, increased prices, reduced nutrient quality, and supplement chain disruption. And then food and agricultural impact are very important in the continent, throughout the continent. Next, please. And then in that context, we need what are the key elements of transformation for Africa? And then as I indicated, we have limited lock-on effect in the continent. The climate resilience, low carbon development is one of the areas we need to explore. I was living outside of Mali for 40 years. And I came back last December. When I came back, I was confronted with two main issues: internet connection, and then to remain working connected at the global world. And the second one was related to electricity, because we all know throughout the sub-Saharan Africa, we have a shortage of power. and then there is a blackout, and two of my computer crashed with the electricity issue. And I decided that I look at what are the different options. Actually, I am fully renewable, solar, 100% solar at home. It's cost effective because the payback period of my investment is less than 4 years. And I'm fully equipped, and I'm fully air conditioning. Everything is functioning with the solar. And then that's possible. And then that need to have a political will in order to be able and then to do that. Adapt to and avoid climate change impact. And then they can go hand in hand, fighting climate and the poverty issue, hunger and malnutrition. And then the improve also health of livelihood, affordable clean energy, and then cleaner water, and then all those different, and then we can look at development first, and then how we make our development more sustainable, and how we make it compatible with climate. And then all those need to be looked at the same time rather than looking at development one aspect. SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and the climate change. Unfortunately, we are in a context that those are compartmentalized rather than bringing together. How you make that development more sustainable, we use the SDGs for that, and then how we make it compatible with the climate imperatives. Next, please. For that, it's important, and then to have a capacity issue, and then the knowledge sharing and technology transfer. And then we need, first of all, to look at, rather than many people will say that we need capacity building, we need to mobilize existing capacity and then to look at where are the areas where capacity are limited. And then so that, and then from that, we invest on capacity building, on education that can improve adaptation. Unfortunately, many African countries are not considering the science of climate as very important. Because in the IPCC, you have no connection with any of the regional institutions, being the CAOS, being the Amponsem, and other. They think that negotiation is very important, is key. But negotiation cannot be achieved without the strong climate science. And then for the last assessment, a report of the IPCC, for the last approval of the IPCC last assessment, we have limited African participated in that. And then we, in order to bring those different elements just to hand up, early warning system can be lead to better preparedness. International collaboration can play a critical part, and technology development also transfer. And then all those are related to the capacity aspect. Next, please. And then those are some of the elements I just wanted to highlight and then to bring to our attention as important as you are leading to the COP26. And sorry to be too long.
Thank you very, very, very much, Doctor. I think when we talk about the fourth day of AfriYOCCC being a technical conversation, these are the reasons why we say that, because we're touching into the heart of the challenges that the African continent faces. And the fact that you have mentioned several important issues that the continent are facing, especially from the report of the IPCC, and even going further to give us examples of country cases, says a lot about what Africa is really facing, our exposure, our vulnerability to climate change. You have mentioned that limiting 1 to 1.5 would be beyond reach because we're experiencing the highest CO2 concentration in 2 million years, sea level rise in its fastest years. And these are things that are really scary. We should be very concerned as a continent because we have really been experiencing some of these vulnerabilities ranging from extreme heat waves, from heavy rain, from drought, especially this year. Countries like Gambia have been experiencing severe heat wave. It's been really hot, and I know it is the case for other African countries. And it is really important that you mentioned the issue of the continent having limited resources and opportunities as we face the extra burden of climate change with these exposures. And the fact that you've also provided recommendations on how we can be able to work in addressing the climate crisis as a continent is something that was also very important, especially with how certain groups, especially farmers, indigenous people, women, continue to be at risk of the climate crisis. And what we need now is to invest in capacity building, especially mobilizing the existing capacities that we have as a continent and sharing knowledge and technology transfer, and specifically with the issue of ensuring early warning system and international collaboration, amongst other things that you've mentioned in your presentation. Thank you very much, Doctor. We really appreciate this. I also know that participants here have questions for you, for Dr. for Richard Munang. So we'll be very happy if you can stay for a while, because we have a portion which we'll be able to take in some questions from the participants. Thank you very much once again, Doctor. We really appreciate this insightful and educative presentation from you. So without wasting much time, we'll just move on to the next presenter, which is Stuart West, who is going to give a presentation on the COP26 priorities and the UK's approach to youth and CSO engagement. So Stuart, I'm sure young participants here, young people here, are excited to hear or eager to hear what the UK government have in place, especially for young people from Africa, given some of the issues that have been happening in relation to COP26 and the participation of young people from Africa. Stuart, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fatou. And can you hear me and see me okay?
Yes, we can see you clearly.
Great, thank you. And let me first start by saying it's an honor for me to join the fourth AfriYOCCC as part of such an esteemed panel. And I'd like to congratulate all of those involved in making this event happen. I only wish I could be with you in person, especially given some of the venues that were mentioned before. But I'm pleased to hear of the rich participation that this virtual format facilitates. As Dr. Munang and Dr. Sokona highlighted, the science is clear. There is absolutely no doubt that human activity has warmed the planet and caused widespread and, in some instances, irreversible changes to it. The impacts of the climate crisis are being felt worldwide, and Dr. Sokona set out in detail that includes Africa and all of its regions. And without immediate and drastic action, the effects will only get worse. It is in that context that the international community comes together in Glasgow in little more than 50 days, with the eyes of the world watching, particularly the now truly global constituency of demand for ambitious climate action that African youth are at the forefront of, joining the fight against the climate crisis, to quote you, Fatou. The COP26 President-designate Alok Sharma has set out 4 goals for COP26, based on the Paris Agreement agreed in 2015, but also on feedback from discussions he has had with governments, with civil society, as well as youth representatives around the world. To achieve the overall goal of keeping 1.5 degrees of warming within reach, we must, 1, put the planet on a path to driving down emissions with mid-century net zero commitments and ambitious 2030 emission reduction targets. 2, protect people and nature from the impacts of climate change. 3, get finance flowing to climate action. And 4th, work together to deliver. And we know that success at COP26 will be judged by our collective efforts to achieve these goals through multiple means, through the negotiated outcome, which I'll come on to in a second, through the enhancement, but also the fulfillment of commitments by national governments, including their nationally determined contributions, as well as their adaptation communications, but also importantly, through the collective actions of governments, business, investors, cities and regions, civil society, indigenous peoples, and youth to reorient our economies and societies towards a net zero and climate resilient future. Examples of this third means being called for quite widely are coordinating plans to phase out coal or to stop deforestation, to speed up the switch to electric vehicles and to invest in renewables. Because as Dr. Munang said, we are talking about accelerating wholesale socioeconomic transformations across Africa and globally. Within the formal negotiations, we face an unprecedented agenda, given what COP26 was always scheduled to address, but also given the need to address issues from 2021, not just 2020, following the postponement of the meeting in light of this tragic COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, given the number of issues that were left unresolved coming out of COP25 in Madrid. So negotiators have their work cut out. As incoming presidency, we facilitated discussion on priorities for the negotiated outcome with a representative group of ministers in London in late July, including a strong showing from Africa. And they emphasized that Glasgow must keep 1.5 degrees in reach, with the negotiations addressing any ambition gaps remaining on adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, and finance, as well as completing the Paris rulebook. And there was an exciting and important sense of urgency amongst them, and a recognition of a political imperative to ensure that real and tangible progress is made across all of these issues in the critical decade to 2030. But of course, that is not an exhaustive list of expected outcomes from COP26. As incoming presidency, the UK is committed to facilitating agreement of an ambitious and comprehensive set of outcomes that leave no issue behind and deliver for all parties, including those most climate vulnerable. Expected outcomes range from addressing outstanding issues relating to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement to enable parties to use market and non-market-based approaches to cooperate in pursuit of their national commitments, to agreeing a new work programme on action for climate empowerment, or ACE, to support youth and other actors to get the education, training, and access to information required on climate, and to participate in processes pertaining to climate action and policy making, which links back to Dr. Munang's comments on the importance of skills and African youth being Africa's powerhouse. And on the subject of ACE, let me recognise the Yungo ACE Youth Forum held in July, a great example of youth participants engaging in and leading on solutions. In that instance, helping to design the ACE work programme, offering invaluable advice to parties on how to fill the gaps and progress the technical work needed to make the new programme a reality in Glasgow. As incoming presidency, we want to work with civil society and youth to amplify and learn from the voices of those most affected by climate change, to inspire governments to increase their ambition and work with us and with each other to deliver a truly inclusive COP and truly inclusive climate action for years to come afterwards. This is why we have established a dedicated civil society engagement team in the COP26 Cabinet Office unit. We've established the COP26 Civil Society and Youth Advisory Council to help guide our planning and preparation for delivering an ambitious and inclusive summit, which includes representatives from across the globe, including activist Elizabeth Wathuti from Kenya. CPD Alok Sharma has also committed to meeting groups that comprise young people and civil society in every country that he visits. And earlier this year, he prioritized visiting countries most impacted by climate change, including Ethiopia, Gabon, and Nigeria, and others, and met local civil society groups there who are leading climate action on the ground. And we convene regular open calls with a large network of youth and civil society organizations to share updates on our planning for COP26. We are delighted to see the determination and passion of the many inspiring young climate leaders across Africa who are spearheading a range of climate initiatives. Looking ahead in the coming weeks, I encourage you to work with and through Youth for Climate delegates selected from countries across Africa to ensure your tangible ideas and solutions for addressing the climate crisis make it into the Youth for Climate Declaration launched in Italy later this month, and inform discussions between youth and ministers in Milan. I also recommend connecting with our British embassies across the African region who are convening youth engagement efforts on climate change. The UK, as incoming COP26 presidency, is endorsing the 16th UN Conference of Youth, COI16, due to take place on the 28th to the 31st of October in Glasgow. And we would encourage young people to register to attend this event and submit a youth statement to inform the COI16 declaration. And allow me to mention that the UK COP26 presidency will be hosting the Youth and Public Empowerment Day on Friday, the 5th of November. And we would recommend connecting with Yungo to see how you can support the preparations for this day. And I look forward to IX exhibition in the Green Zone that same day, and would like to take this opportunity to congratulate those involved for their successful application. There's so much more that I could say, but I'll leave it there for now, given time, and I'm happy to take questions. But let me close by thanking you for having me and for your leadership in both demanding but also driving the action and ambition current and future generations depend on. So thank you so much, and back to you, Fatou.
Thank you very much from us as well, Stuart, for taking time to join us in this very important continental discussion that we're having in the next 3 days. So you've also touched on some very important points, especially what the UK government and the COP26 presidency is doing to ensure that you work with young people, civil society organizations, and relevant stakeholders in ensuring that COP is truly inclusive and helps in amplifying the voices of the most vulnerable people, which obviously the African continent is. So you've also looked at the 4 goals of COP26, which was set based on the Paris Agreement and feedback from the governments and young people, and the fact that you've emphasized on the issue that we need to reorient our economy to net zero emission, because obviously if we want to fight against the climate crisis and reduce our global emission, we really need to look at the issue of reducing our emission level. And the fact that you've also pointed out adaptation and mitigation loss and damage, which really requires a sense of urgency and a sense of political commitment and political leadership as far as the outcome of COP26 is concerned. So young people in Africa are always excited to work with all stakeholders in ensuring that what needs to be done is supposed to be done, because we understand how urgent it is, because all the speakers here have talked about the urgency of climate action and the role young people play as frontline activists or community mobilizers, leaders in addressing the climate crisis. So we're really happy to have you here. And also we have questions for you here. We'll just come back to you with the question and answer. So because we don't have enough time to really just take all the questions, we've taken just one question for each of the speakers here today. And I'll be very, very much happy if you can try as much as possible to have your response in just a minute. We'll definitely appreciate it, so we can move on to the next section. So I'll start with you, Stuart, hence you're still here. So there was a question for you. It said that apart from youth taking part in this conference and having the hard conversations, which are important for awareness, what other way can there be, can young people be able to actively implement the goals and solutions that come out of these forums that we're having, maybe especially COP26?
Thanks. I think it's a really good question, and you've got to think about it in a kind of multi-layer, but also concentric circles perspective. So on the multi-layer, yes, engage in the international exchange, the international discussion, influence as much as you can at that level. But importantly then, it's about translating agreements that are ultimately reached at the international level and ensuring effective and ambitious implementation at the national level. And so that again requires the active engagement, advocacy and action of youth to hold governments accountable and to work with governments to support ambitious delivery on the commitments that they've made internationally, and to go further and faster wherever possible at the national level. And then it's about looking beyond the national level to the local and being the force for change, the force for good, and driving that action, that implementation on the ground, whether that be through university initiatives, civil society initiatives, working with business and investors to create local solutions and local partnerships. It's about working at every single level to make sure that you're influencing, but you're also acting. And I think there's incredible examples of that already happening all across Africa. And so a lot of leadership and lessons to learn for other regions as well.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Thank you very much for that detailed response to the question. Again, we just move on to Dr. Munang in just 1 minute. This is a question for you. It says, how do we advocate and spread awareness on climate change in rural areas in Africa where its effect might not be apparent or obvious.
Thanks again, Fatou. The best advocacy is to lead by example. And what our mothers in villages are waiting for is not only to hear that climate change is happening, it's for us to bring climate action solutions inputs to them, whether we are bringing a solar dryer to help her to reduce her post-harvest losses, or we are helping to bring biofertilizer so that she can apply it on her farm. But let's not forget that some of those in rural areas have coping mechanisms that sometimes we ignore. So we must then be able to also build on what they are doing. And at the end of the day, what matters to that mother in the village is not the word climate change. It's how she can put food on the table and put more money in their pockets. And that's why you heard me saying socio-economic should be the lens in which we should be able to implement climate action. Unless we do that, people might not be able to really buy into it in those areas because they want to put food on the table and more money in more pockets.
Thank you very much. They want to put food on the table and more money in their pockets. Thank you very much, Dr. Richard Munang, for that response to that very question. I think you've really kind of like hit the nail on the head on that. Thank you very much once again. So we'll go to Dr. Sokona. Doctor, in a minute, this is a question for you. Which specific part of Africa have already went beyond the 1.5 degrees Celsius? One of the participants asked that question.
As I indicated, is all the various sub-regions from North Africa, West Africa, Eastern Africa, and Southern Africa have experienced increase of temperature, and then that go beyond 1.5 degree. And as I indicated, all the extreme events we have seen, in particular in Africa, being the cyclone and heat waves, is 1.1 degree at the average, at the global level. Mm-hmm. In Africa, some regions even have more than 2 degrees. Yeah. And then but in a specific location of the 2 degree, and I cannot tell that. Those are the average. And then that is why I indicated that there is a need to increase observation in the region and then to look at the data issue and the information. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. You mentioning the fact that we need to increase observation in the region as well as increase data accessibility and availability. Thank you very much to our 3 keynote speakers, Dr. Youba, Dr. Richard, and Stuart West. You guys have really, really done justice to the role that have been given to you. You have touched on the really relevant information as far as the topics that you've been given is concerned, and we're very much happy to have you here today with us. But before that, we move on to the next thing. The participants really are very eager to connect with the speakers here. Dr. Youba, if you can please share your Twitter handle on the chat. The participants are asking Dr. Richard, Stuart, if you can share your social media handle so the participants can connect with you, because I believe they want to continue conversations with you beyond the discussion that we're having today. Thank you very much once again. We're happy to have you here and talk about these very important conversations that we're having on AfriYOCC 2021. And I am very much sort of like excited now because we are moving to the part of the conversation where we're having all you speakers. I always like to say this quote that anything for the youth without the youth is not for the youth. And AIC is definitely a youth convergence, which means we will be having youth speakers who have been in the field for a very long time, working on NDCs, working on climate finance, working on nature-based solution, etc. These are young people that I've worked with over the years, and they have been very inspiring, given the work that they have been doing at the regional level, the national level, and the international level. So I'll be having our 4th speaker for the topic, the role of young people in addressing climate change and the need for engagement in national climate change policy formulation and implementation. Our 4th speaker is Mr. Chiagozie Udeh, who will be talking about the NDCs. Udeh is currently the global focal point at the UNMGCY and has been working on the NDCs, especially in Africa. And we'll be very much happy to hear from Udeh, especially on this particular topic. So we have 5 minutes for each of the presenters. Udeh, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Fatu. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, perfect. It's really difficult to go after such terrific a line of speakers have already spoken. Really very inspiring to listen to them, but I'll try to be as fast as possible and also make it as basic as possible according to the terms that have been given. I will try to share my screen and let me know if you can see it. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Oh, perfect. So just to say that it's absolutely important that young people are able to engage in national climate policies. All our advocacy, all our actions, whether on the street or in the rural areas or at the international level and the COP negotiations are all headed towards one thing, to get them into policy documents and then to have them implemented. Without capturing these advocacies, these demands, these ideas, without capturing them into international, regional, global climate policies, we're not able to hold on to something that we can call for implementation on, or even to call for more ambition or for more action. On the NDCs, I would just try to make it quite basics. First is that we had the Paris Agreement. Of course, all of you know that we had the Paris Agreement at COP21 in Paris, and this was the basics, in trying to enforce or to implement this agreement. It was supposed to be enforced, or it is being enforced through a document called the Nationally Determined Contributions. The Paris Agreement aims to have below 2 degrees Celsius, or preferably below 1.5 degrees Celsius in pre-industrial levels. It's a basic, of course, a basic improvement on what Kyoto Protocol offered earlier, and gives some kind of balance between binding and voluntary commitments, in the sense that for this NDCs, this document, you have to submit them every 5 years until 2030, and that is at least the part of the agreement that we can sufficiently say is binding. And the NDCs, as they are now, are the main national climate policy documents in most countries, and I can explain why it is so just subsequently. This is just to give you a snapshot into how this came about from the Paris Agreement. You have a communication of new or updated, and this is 5 years after this deadline of 2020 is being a bit affected by the COVID. So a lot of the countries are still submitting their NDCs this year, and we keep submitting. I think the new deadline is in October 12th for another synthesis report just before the COP. And we will have a global stock take 3 years after the deadline, the first deadline for the updated NDCs. And then we'll have a new NDC communicated and updated NDC in 2025, and have another global stock take 2028, and then another NDC in 2030. Other countries or some regional blocs have also gone to the extent of having net zero emission targets, carbon neutral targets, and the rest of them. Some are 2050, some are 2040, and some are also till 2060. So why are we talking about the NDCs? Why are we supposed to be engaging in this document? And how has it looked in Africa? I've been quite engaged in a lot of NDCs globally, but also in a lot of African countries. And what I see in the NDC engagement is that they're not engaging enough young people in most of these countries. I know in a few countries, in some pockets of countries, there's been engagement of young people on the NDC, but it's not widespread. It's not a standard practice. And I know from my engagement in the continent and a lot of countries in the global south, youth engagement in these areas are very tokenistic, because government do not understand how to engage young people, or what it even means to engage young people in a meaningful way. That beyond representation and having young people as numbers on the table, their inputs counting is what is most important to them. So it's very crucial that as young people, all of us here, that we are engaged in our national climate policies, that we demand to be engaged in them if we are not already being engaged, and we also take initiative to initiate this engagement. In some countries, from my experience, young people had to initiate this engagement, take it to the government, to call them to be able to come and to bring them to the table to make inputs to this document. And from the previous indices, the first indices that have been updated, half of them failed to mention children and youths as critical stakeholders. They were mentioned in a lot of places, of course, as vulnerable groups, people that need help, but not as people who should be engaged, who should make inputs to this document. Analysis of the recently updated indices are yet to be complete, but we're hoping that this has improved. But in Africa, from my experience, it's only little improvement, if at all any, and this needs to change, especially in the implementation of the indices and also in the update of the subsequent indices. There are quite a lot of countries in the region that are asked even yet to update their indices, especially in Central and Western Africa, some in Eastern and Southern Africa as well, and some in the Arab region that are yet to update their indices. So you can check within your country and see if you're still in the process and reach out to see how you can engage. And just to make it very quick, I just try to capture a few of the how you can potentially engage in this process. It's that you can, create a core group of young people who are very knowledgeable. There could be young people from your country who are engaged in Yongo, or who are engaged in AIC, or who are engaged, with the other national or regional groups, youth-led ones in different areas. You can make a concept note to start this conversation going, make an idea of what you want to do with the government, how you want your inputs to count, and make contacts with the relevant ministry in your country or with the UNDP office, because in a lot of countries, the UNDP is supporting this work through the UN country team. And the UNDP has a program called Climate Promise that through that they support the NDC implementation or update in the country. And through them, they can put you in touch with the government if you are facing resistance, or if you have a good contact with the government, you can also go through that route. And if there is no buy-in from both places, you can engage with your friends at the regional level, at the global level to help you break the barriers. There will always be contact within your networks who can press the right buttons to get the conversation going. Ensure that these engagements are inclusive of all the young people who are interested in engaging in this, whether they are knowledgeable or not. Bring them on board. It's from the exchange of the experience, rubbing minds together, that you sharpen each other, and those that are less knowledgeable will become knowledgeable and become more competent. One thing is very critical, that during this engagement, the consultation document is most important, that you share consultation document, whether it's through a survey or just a normal Google Doc, that young people are going to make their inputs. You through this collect the input, maybe across sectoral breakdown, or maybe across mitigation and adaptation commitments. However your country's NDC is structured, you need to mirror that to make your input so that it's easy to integrate it into the document. Your first job will be complete when the recommendations, at least as parts of them, are reflected in the final NDC submitted to the UNFCCC. But when you do the consultation, it doesn't even stop there. You need to also come for the validation exercise to make sure that your inputs are integrated. That would be the last phase before it is signed off by the minister. And once submitted, it's important to create a permanent engagement mechanism at the national level to make sure that you are engaging or interfacing with the ministry. You can retain the same group and expand them, or you can lobby and make sure that the ministry buys in to create a permanent engagement mechanism of young people at the national level that interfaces on climate change, and will take this work further, both in implementation, monitoring, and also on a day-to-day climate policy basis. And this will be the vehicle that you would use, to have a very institutional and formal engagement at the national level, which is not really something that is widespread across the continent. Yeah, so this is just the brief thing I want to offer on this occasion. I know we don't have much time, but I've been really inspired by what I've heard at this conference, and I really want to thank my colleagues who are the organizers of this conference for a very fantastic and terrific work. And yeah, I'm looking forward to more action from the young people on here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chiagozie. Asante Sana. That was Udeh did a presentation on the NDCs, which are the a nationally determined contribution. So Udeh is someone that I always reach out to when I have questions about the NDCs. Like, Udeh, do you have a document I can read about this particular NDCs, about this particular country? So you could always connect with Chiagozie on social media, on Twitter. He's going to put his handles there. You can just connect with him and continue the discussions there. But Shekuza mentioned some very important points here in this deliberation, that we have been seeing how youth engagement in the continent and even beyond has been tokenized. We've been seeing tokenistic engagements of young people, and we have to understand that our engagement goes beyond having us just on the table and just having us as numbers. It is how well we are being actively engaged and involved in the decision-making processes of our NDCs and other climate-related adaptation programs. So this has been a challenge. We've been seeing young people taking the lead, engaging our governments, engaging our leaderships to ensure that we have been engaged or involved in this process. And it's quite sad because Udeh even mentioned it, that the first NDCs that we had failed to mention young people and children. Imagine, we constitute the majority of the continent, but we've not been sort of like included or even mentioned in our NDCs. However, we have been seeing progress in our NDCs, and I'm hopeful that if we have more youth engaged in these particular processes like Udeh and others, we're going to be seeing at least some progress in how well the NDCs capture the vulnerable people and have young people engaged in these processes. So thank you very much, Chiagozie. And I'm just going to move on to our next youth speaker. This is Joshua. Joshua has been doing an amazing work on a nature-based solution and adaptation at a different level. And I continue to also be inspired by the work that he does in Ghana through his organization, as well as beyond Ghana. So Joshua is going to talk about our NAPs, which is our National Adaptation Plans. And this is something that he has been really engaged and working on, and we're very much happy to hear from him.
Hello, everyone. Really happy to be here, and thanks to the organizers, of course, and to previous speakers for putting the focus on the need to engage young people, but also to the need to engage meaningfully. And it's really a pleasure to be here today, and to have sort of the African youth mobilized, and then the number of people here and the momentum here really brilliant. I'll quickly be talking about adaptation and the essence and the importance of adaptation, and I would request screen sharing access if that is possible, and then I'll share my screen and quickly go over a few slides. So first of all, I think that under the UNFCCC process, we have different components that are very, very important. Mitigation plays a significant role, and the NDCs have largely sort of focused on this and making sure that there are efforts to reduce our emissions. But another significant part of that have been on the need for communities to adapt and to build resilience. And that has been very, very important. As part of that has been the national adaptation plans, which were set up for countries to be able to develop. And this primarily, and the role of that is that to allow the countries to see how they can formulate medium and long-term goals that are targeted towards reducing risk and being able to make that part of general development as well. And why is adaptation important, and what is adaptation in itself? So briefly, I think in plain words, adaptation seeks to say that, look, there have been enough impacts of climate change that is happening now. We can reduce our emissions, but while we are reducing our emissions, there are countries and there are communities who are seeing the impact of climate change today. And for those communities and for countries that are seeing these impacts, they need the resources, they need the expertise, and they need to start planning on how they can, A, moderate the harm that comes from climate change to those communities, and B, see if possible, even exploit those moments when these hazards manifest for beneficial purposes. So a good example of a typical adaptation project would be that if you live in a coastal area and you're at risk of, say, coastal flooding or coastal erosion, then you're going to have an adaptation project, which would be, for instance, a mangrove restoration project, which would then reduce how fast the erosion occurs. But also in this case, you can exploit the benefit of being able to then have food or even have a livelihood in terms of livelihood that depends on mangrove forests, either for harvesting the mangrove itself at maturity and replacing them, or even fishing in those areas, which is very important, but also ecological benefits of having those buffer zones and intertidal zones for juvenile stage in terms of aquatic organisms, and for also nesting periods for these organisms. So that makes it very beneficial for communities as well. So that is the whole frame of adaptation, but of course it has its own challenges and things that comes along with it. And if you look at the Paris Agreement, the National Adaptation Plan is the main vehicle to deliver commitments on adaptation through the Paris Agreement. So the NAP has been accepted, and it's been going on for a while. Countries are developing plans, but also the real focus is for you to adapt. What are you adapting to? So that is also another important factor, adaptation to what? So which means that at the beginning, if you look at the risk framework, when you look at climate impacts, you have hazards, you have vulnerability, and you have exposure. And these are three different elements. And for you to really adapt, you need to know what are your hazards. So if you live in a coastal area, probably your hazard is not the same as someone who lives in a very dry area, and not someone who lives very close to a freshwater body. These are different geographies with different hazards, and then you need to understand what hazards really. So if you have urban heat islands, then you have a different adaptation project for that, and then you know what vulnerabilities exist. And if you have storms and cyclones, which I mean, in 2019, the continent saw Cyclone Idai and its impact, and then you require specific adaptation measures for that, because the vulnerabilities will be different from when you have urban heat island or drought. So this is the whole concept of it, and why this is very important. And then the NAP process itself, it's really a policy document that young people have to work with. We all have to be a part of it. But then again, there's a global argument, and I'm going to get to this in a bit. There's a global argument of we need to reach net zero. This is important. I agree that it's important, but what we have to understand for young people on the African continent is that yes, net zero is important, but our future is really at risk if we do not adapt now, and if we do not push for resilience to build now. Why? Because if young people are not able to access school days and better education, if young people are not able to have better food and suffer malnutrition now, the long-term impact of that is very expensive for the continent as a whole. So this is very important. We need resilience infrastructure for education, resilience infrastructure for health. We need investment coming into communities such that they do not get knocked down into poverty over and over again. And if you look at this map here, you see that if you look at countries that are submitting their NAPs, that are planning their NAPs, and if you look at this map, all the darker areas are those who are actively working on their NAP and getting it started and working on it. Those who are lighter a little bit are planning it, still in the planning phase is very important before they arrive at it. And if you look at all the very light areas, nothing is being done. Why? Because mostly these are countries where adaptation is not the top of their priority. They are more focused on let's reduce emissions, which is important. But as we saw this year, for instance, in Western Europe and the floods that occurred in the US, adaptation needs to get to everybody. We all need this. But it's also here seeing the argument that we, as an African continent, and our colleagues and other communities along the global south, where socioeconomic conditions are very difficult, we are even more crippled, and we need adaptation the most. So we need to champion that advocacy. It should be our voice really leading the adaptation front and getting our colleagues in the global north to see the essence of adaptation. And this is very important. And this is the process for adaptation briefly. So typically, as a country and as a party developing that process, will go through the planning phase, which is a lot of sort of thinking, again, deciding what is the hazard, what is our exposure, and who is vulnerable, and who do we have to protect, and what is our critical infrastructure, and how do we channel that and put that on paper. Then that preparatory element and that groundwork leads to implementation. And then through that implementation stage of actually working on the ground and making sure that you're protecting livelihoods and everything, it moves on to the monitoring and evaluation. And that is also a preparatory element, because adaptation is still fairly a new concept, because we do not even have enough evidence. It's going to take years and years to be able to know, okay, what are the evidence for adaptation and how is it delivering people from these impacts? So it's still a cycle, and the monitoring evaluation phase still feed into the planning process. And in this bits of it, there you see that there is a need for capacity building, the finance, which we all know that ahead of COP26, the biggest advocacy, which I think is very important, and we should all support that, is making sure that folks in Global North deliver on the 100 billion commitment for climate action, and making sure that 50% of that goes into adaptation or even more. And then, of course, the institutional arrangement at the local level to make sure that adaptation is delivered is also very important. Quickly, I want to give a practical example of what adaptation is and how a project could look like, because most people think of, oh, adaptation, what can I do, and what is it, and what is a good example of this? So in 2018, Chad had a project which was really sort of as part of the UNEP in 2018 with funding approved, and it was really about the sensitive sectors. And here you understand the concept of vulnerability, right? So which sector of the economy is really vulnerable to the impacts of climate change? How do we protect that? How do we build a resilient infrastructure for that to make sure that when the impacts of climate change happen, when the droughts come in, when the floods come in, these sectors are protected, and we do not get people still sort of losing their income and losing lives, and of course the non-economic losses as well. So specific solutions to these, as per the NAP at that time, was access to climate information. This is very important. You need to understand, you need to know what are the impacts, you need to know how to get ready for it. So this was important. Then building the capacity of national, regional, local actors to collect and analyze data and climate information. This is something a lot of us can get ourselves into, a lot of young people can really support with at the national level. Of course, being able to focus resources at the national level and also resources for development into adaptation was also very important, but also being able to know who do we support. The sector as a whole is there. That is the livestock, fisheries, water resources, but then knowing who in this sector do we support, what is the beneficiary, and who do we focus on. So these were some of the sort of a concrete example of how a NAP could look like. And of course, this was also essential for them to sort of identify who are the vulnerable groups within our community and within our country. So quickly into how can you get involved, and as young people, and over the past 2 years, I've led a couple of research around youth engagement on adaptation specifically. The latest, which was launched just a couple of weeks ago, which was youth and barriers and opportunities to adaptation. And here, some of the key messages. One, young people need to be part of the NAP process. Why? Because soon we are going to be the ones in decision-making process. If we miss the opportunity of understanding the context now while we are youth, we get into that position and we lose the young people again because we do not get them, right? There's been so many times said this year and over the past few years that adults and people in these high position decision makers are making decisions for young people without getting their context. And that is because at that time, where before they got into this thing, the thinking and the approach of how young people do things was not probably integrated into the way they do stuff. But we are here now. We are not yet at the top level of sort of being a minister or being a president or being the lead negotiator, but we are here now. We know the concerns. We need to start learning how the process works in terms of the development, the implementation, the planning. Knowing it now is very helpful rather than knowing it later when you are no longer within the youth community. Two, generally, young people believe that good governance is the basic framework for a successful adaptation. And that means that collaboration, right? Collaboration and allowing people to lead and giving people the opportunity to drive. And this is very important for us to know. As young people, we need to enhance collaboration amongst each other, be able to work with each other to drive the agenda forward. Higher education tends to correlate with participation and leadership in adaptation. And here, so what do we do with this information as part of the research? This is clear that as a continent, we need to focus on expanding education and adaptation. There is a lot of sort of capacity building, sensitization going on across different countries on climate, mostly still focus on mitigation. We need to plant more trees and we need to reduce emissions and we need renewable energy and all of that. Great, but we need people to understand that at this point, even if you have solar across the whole continent, there is an impact coming and we need to be ready for it. And getting people to understand this is very important, particularly for young people. Then again, higher community level engagement found in Africa, while policy engagement is less. And here I think it's sort of a call to everyone, especially our senior members in the call today, really join us in the advocacy of getting our policymakers, the AU and the relevant institutions to really work with young people on policies. We can approach, we can engage, but we need them to open the room for us as well. And when we're on the table, we need them to see us as equal stakeholders. So this is my short presentation. Really, thank you very much. and looking forward to further engagements. Thanks.
Joshua, I always say that young people, especially with the work that we continue to do, people like you with the work that you're doing, especially with adaptation, continues to be an inspiration. And the fact that you've more or less kind of like touched the nail right on the head, especially with the fact that when it comes to the policy-making processes of our NABs, young people are hardly engaged, which makes it very difficult for what we really want or what we really need to be included in these processes. And the fact that you have talked about adaptation and resilience, which are really, really, really urgent for the African continent, even though reducing our or reaching net zero and reducing our emissions are also important. And I'm very happy to hear the work that has been done, especially so far with the NAB, and how young people can continue to be engaged. You've talked about the issue of collaboration, which is very crucial, and I always also emphasize on that. For us to be able to ensure that we continue to build our resilience, we need to have better collaboration as young people and as communities. Thank you very much, Joshua. This was a very detailed presentation and very insightful. Thank you once again. Also, if you don't mind, share your details on the chat because participants are also asking for it. That'll be great. And we will move on to our next youth speaker, which is Deon from Namibia. Deon has been in the climate space for years, and he's someone that always will be saying, we need to have more young people in the space. We need to have more young people to join the movement, the climate movement, because it's very important. He is very much passionate about that. And we're very much happy to be having Deon here today to talk about action for climate empowerment, because obviously knowledge sharing, capacity building, information sharing is very, very important as far as the work that we're doing as young people in the continent is concerned. And we couldn't have had a better person to do this presentation than Deon. Deon, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. Fatu, please confirm if I'm audible.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Greetings to everyone. I recognize all introductory remarks that were said by the previous speakers, from Dr. Richard to the fellow doctor on IPCC, and also most importantly, my fellow colleagues, Joshua and Amponsem, and Udeh, who delivered very good presentation. Now, my presentation for this particular talk will focus on the importance of youth as to why you should be involved in climate policy, in particular trying to leverage some of the experience we've used. First and foremost, I think having listened to what everybody said, it's safe to say that we can only add in to those great presentations, but can't really take from them. And I'd like to borrow rather from some of them in my views. The first thing I want to make clear to people is that climate policies are basically a conglomerate of various stakeholders advancing their role and interest in meeting national climate targets. Now, that means you then have the different industries and the different sectors that are coming together to push within the climate policy what would be beneficial to their work. That's the first point, meaning as young people, we should approach climate policies from that perspective as a lobbying tool that you can utilize to further finance your initiatives. Now, the other issue to keep in mind also is that while the process of the whole UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, basically at all levels, is led by the best available science and knowledge, therefore, we must understand that policy formulation is actually a political process which falls under the values of democracy and underpinned by the rule of law. And as such, young people have tend to be very active and involved in policies so that you are within the fine print and you don't have to rely on charities, philanthropy, or the lenience and goodness of a particular individual. It should be the state within its organs and statutes and policies in this case that should be empowering young people. But most youth do not actually see it like that. And I think that's where we lose out a lot. Traditionally, young people had no formal position in climate negotiation, apart from cross-cutting issues like Article 10 in the, or let me start with Article 6 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which focuses on public participation, access to information, training, education, and such. You have Article 10 of the Kyoto Protocol, which also speaks and touches on capacity building. And then the Marrakesh accords and declarations are also focused on capacity building. And I think within that nutshell is how the youth agenda to climate change has been progressing for a while. So I think it's important that we start to branch out within the other sectors and move a little bit away from this cross-cutting perspective and become a wholly institutionalized section of the society. And I think the NDCs are partly trying to justify that youth engagement. Now, until the year 2009, we really didn't have a formal position in youth, but that's when we received the formal recognition as a constituency for children and youth within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that particularly means, as Dr. Richard was saying, we are then regarded as a non-state actor. And that leaves us with little mandate to actually, at the negotiations at least, force a position or a propositions and counter what we try to kind of like think is more important to focus on within the negotiations. We are always limited to that. And that is why we are compelled to be a bit more strategic, hence the need for for youth engagement in national climate change policy formulation and implementation. That would also serve as a balancing act to our international formation, activism, and climate position. For example, I'll come back to that example as to how we as young Africans have utilized this strategy that I've just set out. One must also remember the best way to hold parties to account and or to support actions at a national level is through domestic legislation. Because you have to thoroughly understand the national frameworks and climate governance architecture within your state so that you are moving within the mechanisms and confinements of the law. That would protect young people, especially at least us in Africa. We have a really tough time as active engagement and meaningful participation actors to contribute. And I think to avoid the politics and to avoid any issues of properly being represented at policy level, it's a very, very important step. That also ensures that future generations can continue and benefit from your work, as opposed to just pushing it alone from your NGO, doing meetings and just having position papers for your NGO, but little is going into the state consciousness. Now, the other issue of when you understand your various frameworks, you'll then be compelled again to join various committees and technical working groups at a national level that support or monitor or implement these climate targets that our countries commit to. And for example, in Namibia, we've had the National Climate Change Committee, which I was a part of. And we also have the Sustainable Land Management Committee, which is particularly following the UN Convention to combat desertification and drought. And then we had one on biodiversity, but currently Namibia is formulating all three into what we call the National Committee of the Rio Convention. And therein, we would continue to support youth engagement. I think that is a very, very good step at national level because it now ensures that you are recognized as a stakeholder who's supposed to report back and also monitor and hold to account your state and support where needed. Once you are resourceful to these institutions and stakeholders of governing the climate architecture in your state, it's then easier to influence policy because you will now be invited to meetings. You will now be asked for very difficult questions because nobody has a golden answer to this issue. And especially as African states where we have to redivert funding that was needed for other development targets, innovation and frugality would be very important. And I think the energy of young people is key to this. So in the 48th session of the subsidiary body for implementation in Bonn at the Conference of Parties, the 23rd session, this is where I would like to make an example of how we as African youth utilize our functionalities. One of them was that as international youth, we knew that there was a ACE workshop, Action for Climate Empowerment workshop coming up because the parties had agreed to continue describing and further breaking it down in terms of how it will be implemented at a national level. And remember that ACE is actually a very youth-related agenda. So as the international youth, we felt like if they're having a workshop on ACE, it's very important that youth are there. Now, as African youth, our worry was how do we get to Bonn? Because it was a bit easier for some of our colleagues who lived in Europe to just take a train ride. And we started off of that ground negotiating within the confinements of the youth constituency. And we faced a lot of challenges because we were brought back to the fact that you are a non-state actor and you are no different from women or any other group, regardless of your vulnerability. And as such, we as the African youth, particularly myself and Nesreen, we approached the African group of negotiators to get some extra support to complement our efforts as the international youth. And one of the things that came out there is we didn't realize how useful that is, because long story short, the G77 plus China group would end up taking on what we were proposing and put it to the floor. So much so that the chair opened up the space and allowed them for young people to be part of the process. And parties at the end of the day agreed that they are going to support, or at least those that financially supported, agreed that they will support an ACE Youth Forum. And that was the first time an ACE Youth Forum was established within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I think it's very much to highlight the role of youth when you work with negotiators, when you know which leads are following which particular issue, when you also understand what your power as a young group is, because you must follow the principles of the UNFCCC Convention, which helps us a lot when we're engaging parties, because this process can be very, very technical. And I also think parties should take into account that ACE, at least for African youth, is an agenda we need to fight hard, because young Africans are still, a lot of them are still out of school. In 2019 alone, if I understand correctly, Niger had at least over 1-point-something million children out of school, followed by Tanzania and Mali. And in total, sub-Saharan Africa had around 33.8 million children out of school. Currently, the ACE agenda is focusing on also education, but I think we as African youth should particularly ask for a differentiated response so that it can target especially the young people who are out of school and don't have the opportunity to learn because they have to go to work or tend to cattle or whatsoever. But if they are not accommodated within the agenda for education and training, access to information, they may just become the very difficult individuals that we will have a tough time to work with. So in short, that is like my experience for young people within the national climate processes. And I think we need a little bit more fellow youth at the national level, institutionally, financial mechanism. And if I can just end it with I had some thoughts I wanted to share on without youth in policy formulation, we should remember that we can be overlooked. As I mentioned, the different sectors set up, such as the agriculture, forestry, land use, IPPU, energy attributions for industry, plants and processes, and waste. But we as the youth must start to see ourselves as a stakeholder that complements this section. Secondly, if youth don't co-design the national response in order to effectively identify opportunities and entry points, we won't be able to make use of our policies properly because we were not part of these policies. Second, young people can co-defend the national policies and mobilize other institutions at national level, because in Africa, we still have that issue where the Ministry of Climate Change has to over-encumber themselves with all the activities of convincing all the other state institutions of policy for that de facto institutions can be designed within the policies. Otherwise, we will be left behind. And also, finally, it ensures access to financial mechanisms. Most governments are accessing funding. We spoke to the Green Climate Fund. I remember in 2019 as youth, we tried to get a youth quota thereunder. And I think it's important to revisit that conversation so that youth don't have to suffer and continue financing their own efforts, which defeats the purpose of our role because we are unable to meet the full potential thereof. I will leave it there for now. And I thank you very much for everybody who joined.
Thank you very much, Deon, Shekuza, for that insightful deliberation on action for climate empowerment and what young people need to do, as well as our role in pushing for our active participation in processes that actually concerns us. And you've also looked and mentioned very critical and important points as far as ACE is concerned and young people, especially with the fact that when it comes to national climate change policy involvement, it is always young people that are lacking behind. And that makes it very difficult for our voices and our concerns to be effectively incorporated. And you've also talked about how ACE is an agenda that young people need to fight for. Looking at the challenges that we face in our continent, even still children and young people don't have access to educational facilities and services. So ACE is definitely something that we continue, or we should keep pushing for, to ensure that there is equal access to opportunities and information that young people will need to know as far as issues concerning climate change is concerned. And one thing again that you've also talked about is the fact that young people have really sort of like been overlooked. We have been overlooked in processes actually from all sectors, from the energy sector, the finance sector, policymaking sector, etc. And these are things that we need to keep pushing and fighting for. You've given an example of the efforts that you've been doing with other colleagues in ensuring that we push for the agenda of young people and all of that. And the fact that we need to access financial mechanisms as young people, amongst other things that you've delivered on. Thank you very much, Deon. You've really done justice to the fact that action for climate empowerment is a critical and important aspect of youth climate engagement within the continent. Thank you. Deon, you should try, if you can share your social media handles so participants can connect with you beyond the conference. Thank you very much once again, Deon, for that presentation. So we're going to be having our final speaker, youth speaker for the day. This is going to be Maria Uma. Maria is or has been working on climate finance over the years. Maria is someone that is very much passionate about climate finance. And so all the speakers that we have here today are passionate in what they have delivered on. You could see it from the presentation. You could see it from how well they deliver their points. And Maria is no exception. And I'm very much eager to hear from her on climate financing as far as youth climate engagement is concerned in the continent. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fatou, and thanks to the amazing speakers and what they've shared. I'm going to speak briefly about climate finance and what young people are doing. And I don't really want to take up a lot of time, so just tell me if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
All right. Let's go to the first bit. Okay, so basically what we are doing as young people, I mean, I like the way Deon ended it. He said something about young people should not be struggling to finance their own initiatives that they have already started, which is really true. And this has been going on for a very long time. So what we decided to do, both BLI Global and Drop Access, together with my friend Dolphin, is we decided to create a space where there wasn't any, because we realized that with the Green Climate Fund, as much as there is ambitious targets to meet the $100 billion fund, there still isn't enough room for young people to be able to access the financing. And what is there? There's a lot of like red tape, and you have to have this and this and this all put together before you're able to access the funding. So we started something called the Global Youth Climate Action Fund. And as a backdrop, we had already started having these conversations back in New York during the high-level meeting, and then COP25 session. And then we're like, you know what, we're not going to wait for the adults to invite us to the table. Let's just start something and see what kind of momentum we can get from it. So, but before I dive into what the GYCAF is, I just wanted to speak briefly on what climate finance is under the UNFCCC framework. And it's specifically covered in Article 9 of the Paris Agreement. Some of the key aspects of the Article 9 paragraph specifically is one, the role of developed countries. And then we have the agenda of mobilizing climate finance, and also provisions for vulnerable parties. So the paragraph 1 is about the need for developed countries that already have significant amount of financial and technical resources to be able to provide, contribute these resources to developing countries. And then paragraph 3 is about how much should be how should the financing take place? It speaks about public funding, and that would be like taxes. So for example, here in the States, the contribution that the US gives towards the Green Climate Fund actually comes from taxpayer money. So it's really important to know when US citizens are voting for their next president or for their leaders, they have to vote for someone who has the agenda of climate change as a priority. Otherwise, it gets pushed down the table, as you saw in the previous years with the Republican Party. And then also the provision for vulnerable parties, which is like list developing countries for one, and then small island development states. So that would be like the island states that are experiencing a lot of the hurricanes and the tornadoes and the floods. They would be a priority to receive this funding. And then you go to the ex-ante communication. This is very critical, especially when it comes to the global stocktake, NDCs and all that stuff, because this is where you get to see what kind of contribution, how much and where the money is going. So say, for example, Norway, which has actually recently submitted their ODA, their quantitative and qualitative information of how they're spending their public money, has submitted a report, and it clearly outlines what is going to mitigation efforts, adaptation efforts, both within their country, but also to developing countries. And you have people who are, you have countries like Ghana, Uganda, some in the northern and also the eastern parts of Africa that are receiving this kind of money. And it clearly spells out, it's really important to take this into consideration, because we say, where is the money? So this is the area where you see how much, which countries are actually making climate change a priority and climate finance a priority, and where who are actually putting their money where their mouth is. And then you have also a section on the financial mechanisms, which is the means of which the finance flows towards adaptation, mitigation, ACE, and all the others. And that would be the GCF, the GEF, and the Standing Committee on Finance. And then you have a section on the readiness program that says, it says in the Paris Agreement that it should ensure efficient access to financial resources through simplified approval procedures. But from the feedback that we got during the COP session, there was a lot of not so good feedback from especially developing countries about the access to funding from the GCF, because they felt like the readiness program was too strict and they weren't really seeing the money even when they had already been accredited. So that needs to be addressed at that level. But I think that is also something that young people should also be advocating for at the regional level and country level. And so just briefly what the financing mechanisms are. So the Green Climate Fund, as I previously mentioned, the target was $100 billion annually. So that was supposed to be every year, raising 100 billion. And it was set to be ambitious so that countries can step up. But as of now, they've only raised about $8.2 billion, which is not really good. And if you even go deep, if you go to their dashboard, you see that actually only 6 billion of it has actually been implemented and 2 billion has been disbursed. So that is a little bit worrying, because then you wonder how are people actually financing their NDCs or their NAPs, and how are young people involved in this entire process. And then the Adaptation Fund, which gets its funding through a 2% levy on the CDM under the Kyoto mechanism. And basically, this is run by the World Bank, and what they do is they convert carbon emission credits and monetize them, and then they hold that money in a fund. And according to the Adaptation Fund Board, they then disperse it to whichever projects are approved. And then you have the GEF, which has been there for a while now. And the interesting thing about them is that I'm not sure if a lot of people know that they actually help support a lot of the international environment mechanisms like UNCCD, UNFCCC, UNCBD, And under it, you have and this is really important, especially for the African continent, because they operate the Least Development Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund, which is something that Africa and projects in Africa benefit a lot from. If you go to their website, you'll see how much money they have put into it, especially towards disaster risk reduction, water stresses, agriculture, and innovation around those areas. And then lastly, you have the Standing Committee on Finance that does the helps with assisting on the reporting aspect on it, especially for members of states and parties. And then now this brings it lastly to the Global Youth Climate Action Fund, which is the GYCA fund, something that we decided to start because we felt like all these other mechanisms lacked, especially with addressing the need for financing for young people. And so basically what we do, what the vision of the fund is to raise $100 million by 2030. The time frame is not as ambitious as the DCF because firstly, we are a youth-led organization and it takes time to raise money, which is something that a lot of people aren't really aware of. However, the fund is targeting to finance youth-led action, especially in developing countries. And we already started a capacity building program under the readiness framework. We are doing a session this Friday on financing towards net zero. I've had a lot of talk about it. So if you're interested, please visit us and see. We have an amazing panel of guests of people who are actually already involved in that process. And the reason we are focusing on young people is, as you mentioned, we feel like there's a gap of financing for youth projects specifically and youth innovations, and young people really have the energy to solve for climate change. So they need to be invested in. Where we are now is we're doing a capacity building, as I mentioned. We're developing, the webinar is to lead towards the COP26, and we are soon to launch the phase 2 of the readiness program. Our bold vision. Right now, we are still sorting out the Youth Fund Board. We received a lot of applications for that because we want this to be run by young people, for young people. We also will be having ambassadors, and we are also hoping to launch a scholarship program for the COP26 so we can bring young people to the international conference and they can see and appreciate what it means to be involved in policy and how they can actively be involved in the policy. As further plans for the fund progress, we're obviously going to look at other instruments, so like capital financing, debt financing, private equity financing, but that's like later down the road. For now, we are doing grants-based funding, and that's our criteria. As you mentioned, it's young people basically, and that's our grant focus. And I think lastly, we just welcome support and we hope you visit us on our social media platforms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, the climate finance, youth climate finance expert. And definitely you have shown why we need climate financing, especially with one that is actually youth focused. And you have touched on different youth financing or just climate financing mechanism. But you have also pointed out the fact that most of these climate financing initiatives that we have more or less kind of like lacks young people in there or just support for young people. I'm happy to hear that you've mentioned the work of the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the Global Environmental Facility, the Standing Committee on Finance, and the fact that you and your team have taken up the initiative to establish the Global Youth Climate Action Fund. And I'll just be following to see how this goes and the progress of the work. Thank you very much once again, Maria Uma, for that brilliant presentation on youth climate financing. So we've really gone above time. We should have ended the event, but it's beyond our control. But just to quickly share that our partners, which is the GBYN, which is the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, that is the African Caucus, is hosting a side event today, which is going to be on African youth and the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. It is actually starting sort of like now. So for people here who want to really attend the side event that is organized by the GBYN, please try to sort of like join us in this conversation. Also, we'll be having a sessions for the next 2 days, tomorrow, which is going to be the high-level dialogue, which will be hosted by my colleague Elizabeth, and the third day where we'll be having the launching of the African Youth Position Paper and the Green Book by the IE team. So we're expecting or anticipating to see you guys in the next 3 days, because we'll be having very, very important lineup of activities or events. So before we wrap up, because we're supposed to be wrapping up right now, we'll just take one comment from one of the participants, because yeah, we've been seeing a lot of questions and comments from the participants, which is quite encouraging. So we just take just one person for the floor to share one or two things that they might want to before we officially wrap up the event for today. So if you just raise your hand, and I'll see it in the, and then you'll be called. So we have 2 participants raise their hands. So can we have Landry? Yeah. So Landry, in a minute, if you can share your thoughts. You can unmute yourself, Landry. Okay, so Landry is having the issues, I think, with the mic right now. So we're just gonna give it to Rogie, who also raised the hand, to quickly come up and share one or two things in a minute.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Kelvin from Kenya.
All right.
I'm very grateful for this webinar. So it's a question and also a thought. What's the position of youths in the grassroots in national action plans? How should youths engage themselves? Those in grassroots, because they are mostly affected by the climate change. So I came in the meeting late, sorry. So I was just asking if it was clarified on the meeting or.
Oh yeah, I think that question was, thank you very much, Kevin, for that question. That question was basically answered by Dr. Richard Munang, but you can still check the chat. I believe you will be able to see it there. But thank you very much for that. So guys, I have been informed that we are overtime, and our side event by our partners, which is the GBYN, has started. So thank you very much, everyone, from our speakers, Maria, Uma, Deon, Shekuza, Dr. Richard Munang, from Joshua, Chiagozie, Udeh, Stuart, and every presenter we've had today. You guys have really done justice to the topic that has been given to you, shared very important points as far as youth climate engagement within the continent is concerned. And we're very much happy to have you here as our speakers. And to all our participants, thank you again for taking time to join these very crucial conversations we're having here today and the next 2 days. So don't forget to follow the conversations that we'll be having on our social media platforms as well. Don't forget to use the hashtag to share your comments and contributions on our Twitter and our Facebook pages. Let's continue the conversation. Let's continue to build the momentum. Let's continue to have this kind of conversations, because this is what the continent needs. We need more active youth engagement in climate-related processes. And we can only do that if we have collaboration, if we have partnership, and if we continue to build momentum. Thank you very much. I was your host for the first year of AfriYOCCC 2021, Fatih Jeng. Bye. See you guys tomorrow.
Can we have a group pic?
Oh, yes. Elizabeth is saying, can we turn on our cameras to just have a quick group picture before we Can we turn on our videos or our camera so we can just take a quick group photo for our social media platforms?
Maybe Amanda can assist us with this.
She's not on there, but I'll take the screenshot, Liz.
Thank you.
Wait. I cannot see Juliet is not on. Landrin is not on. Okay, let me just take the ones we have. All right, thank you guys.
Say cheese or AfriYOCCC 2021.
With that voice reflects.
Oh, but the face, so we can have cheese.
With that voice reflect in the video.
Okay, guys, thank you so much. Thank you, guys.
All right, bye.